Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV, co-sponsored by AMF Capital, the Baljanik Law Firm, the Butler Exchange Group, and the construction firm J.R. Johnson.
Welcome back to HFO-TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. Today we are going to be talking to Gerard Mildner, head of the Portland State University Real Estate Department. This is going to be a video conference meeting with what's going on. It's April 1st, so we're going to just trying to get some content out as we can't do social distancing. We're not able to get together, so we're trying this new medium and see how it works. So again, Gerald, I want to thank you for coming. Always appreciate your insight into housing and politics and what's going on in the city of Portland and the state of Oregon. Which kind of leads us into this paper that you did that we've got the link up to, is the crisis in the Portland real estate market. About regulations and where we have been and where we are. So, I mean, in times of what's happened in the last 3 years from Oregon in terms of housing markets and being one of the most probably least regulated to maybe how that's changed. Maybe you can kind of relate to that and
Right. Well, I see there's being kind of three different housing crises that we have out there. One is the problem of the homeless and the street population, and I think we made a choice under Mayor Hales to allow people to camp on sidewalks and camp in public parks. We've resisted policies that would create shelters on demand, so that under the Ninth Circuit of the U.S. District Court, they don't let you remove people from the street unless you have an alternative place for them to go.
Right.
So I think that we've totally mucked up this situation with the homeless. I mean, part of it is our climate, but our climate was just the same 10 years ago, and we didn't have this same problem. I think we also have to recognize that huge fractions of the street population are heroin users, and so they're on the street in part because of their addiction problems, and we don't really have great systems in place to deal with that. And the same is true of the mental illness. I mean, there's some overlap in those two, but a huge fraction of our homeless population is also mentally ill. So that creates its own challenges and dynamics. And there have been some discussion about trying to replicate the Eugene model, where they have non-police intervention and to try to help the homeless get more properly situated. So I consider the second challenge for us is this huge differences in incomes between people who have skills and went to college and went to high school. They're outside of the coronavirus situation. They're all largely employed and doing well, versus the folks who didn't get a high school education and have looking for manual labor, which is largely dried up. And then I would say that the third problem that we face is just a lack of housing supply, and this has dogged us for 20, 30 years.
Especially on the West Coast.
No more housing today than we did back in the 1990s, which is as a region.
No, and I think that one is as we've kind of said, especially on the West Coast, you've just seen a lack of housing supply. When you look at the immigration population, people moving to urban centers, you're just not able to build enough housing for these groups, and inevitably, we talked about the homeless, and we've talked about, I think it's hard to have a conversation about housing without talking about affordable housing, without talking about income inequality. But the other basis is that we just don't build enough housing, period, a multifamily or a single family.
Yeah, it's the thing which connects the street population to the low income workers to the middle income households, is the fact that we are not producing enough housing. That in turn makes the normal filtering of housing not function very well. So we produce in most metro areas 1 to maybe 3% of the housing stock each year. If it was a fast growing city like a Dallas or a Houston, we might be making 3%. But that new housing is always going to be much higher in quality and therefore much higher in price than the typical home in a metro area. I used to cite a number like 40,000. Now it's closer to $100,000 difference between new versus the average existing home price. And so for somebody who's of modest means, pick your employment, but let's just assume a household of modest means. If they're looking for something that's affordable, that's something that they can afford, they're going to look for an older house, a house that's was built 40, 50 years ago, that's depreciated in value, and has been freed up because new housing was built for higher income households. So I think we set very unrealistic expectations when we try to recommend new housing for low income households. I mean, everybody would prefer as high quality housing as they can get, but for somebody who's got a modest income, they have to think more modestly about how much housing or the type of housing that they can afford. And if we're not building the new stuff for the high income folks, that doesn't free up the old stuff, the old housing for the middle and lower income households.
So how do you, I mean, from where we've been and knowing, with the housing production or lack thereof, talk a little bit about how you see, added it just seems like in the last 10 years, just the added regulations put on for producing housing, and how that's kind of an effect is causing this more roadblocks to getting more housing produced. It's almost counterintuitive. We know we have a shortage, but we're going to make it more punitive to develop and put new housing in place. It just seems like there's this disconnect on policy made and what the ultimate goal would be. I mean, how do you see that in relationships in cities?
Yeah, I think part of this comes from the planning system that we inherited from the late 1970s, where it was assumed that we could simply build up rather than building out. And I remember in the mid 90s attending a bunch of public hearings where the question was, do we as a region build up or build out, right? Do we expand the suburbs? Do we create satellite cities for places like Woodburn and Canby and McMinnville to become commuting hubs leading into downtown? Kind of like what the British did in the Green Belt with places like Milton Keynes, which became kind of commuting suburbs on a railroad line.
Right.
Or do we densify our existing urban footprint? And it was presented as almost a design choice, right? Do you like high rise or low rise? Well, I don't know. If the price is the same, I might go for the high rise. But I think what was not appreciated then and still isn't appreciated today is that going for these higher density development forms typically costs more per square foot.
Exactly.
And so if you look at and basically buildings in our region come in three flavors, three density types. 2-story construction is the norm for single family homes and is the norm for garden apartments in the suburbs. 5-story housing is allowed by the fire marshal, where you build a concrete podium, and then on top of that you can build four levels of wood construction, so-called 4/1 construction. And that costs about 50% more, but might be worth doing if the land costs are really, really high. And so consequently, you see that development all over Portland, along the major arterials up to 39th Street on the east side, maybe as north as Killingsworth. Certainly on the west side, downtown Beaverton is seeing quite a bit of that. But once you go out of those areas, you just don't see very much of it. If you go through Hillsborough, unless it's subsidized, you don't see 5-story construction, for the simple reason that the land costs are low and the rents are low, and so it's never economic to do that. And then finally, true high rise that's bigger than 5 stories has to require steel and concrete construction. That costs yet another 50% more to actually build on a per square foot basis. And again, you will only do that in the immediate core. And so making assumptions that these kind of high-rise developments would happen in places like Gateway and 82nd Street or downtown Hillsborough is just not believable. And yet, from a planning point of view, satisfies the planner's requirement that 50%, that we have a 20-year land supply. So I've argued that for quite a while now that the land use planning system is just not giving enough of the raw materials for the development industry to produce housing at the price points that are really needed. And now we're adding all these new regulations, that have, I think, largely as a result of the run up in demand since the Great Recession, since 2008, 2009, and the failure to accommodate all the Californians that want to move to Portland.
Well, you've got California, you've got Midwest. I mean, Midwest people moving here. I think, and as I used to tell people when we came out of the Great Recession, lenders were very conservative in terms of for developers. So you only had a certain, because 8 and 9 wiped out a lot of the smaller developers who did a lot of smaller projects. So you had at the beginning, based on numbers, we should have been building a lot more units 10, 11, and 12. It took a little while to ramp up. So again, we've got this shortage, and we still have the in-migration. We used to joke around about Gateway 10, 15 years ago when they put light rail. You'd talk to landowners and they'd say, hey, my 1 acre site, you can do a 8, 9 story building. We'd say, I know it's zoned that, it may say that, but economically it doesn't make sense. And so I think you're right, there's that disconnect of, hey, if you look at the vacant land, look at what the density is, but it's not going to get fully utilized. We're even seeing that with inclusionary zoning. Because of the regulations, we've got sites that could do 30 units, 29 units. Well, the person's only going to do 19 units because once he goes to 20, we have inclusionary zoning taking place. So it's kind of like the policy's not really connecting with the mechanism, and the unintended consequences are not, just exasperates the problem.
Yeah, and putting the stress of the coronavirus situation just only makes things worse. I mean, we're seeing, so we've had proposals to, because we didn't backstop the salaries, we're seeing now a whole swath of people who don't have the income to pay their rent, and of course today's day one for paying your rent. And there's now proposals that commercial tenants get 90 days, that some idiot in Salem and City Hall are proposing. So I think that's going to get shot down in part because it's not immediately obvious that a tenant is low income and a landlord is rich, and frankly, landlords and tenants on the commercial side, and here I'm thinking about office tenants, thinking about restaurants, big box stores, grocery stores. There's a lot of negotiation that's happening. People in the real estate industry are not sitting still right now. They're very busy because they've got mortgages to pay and a fear that there isn't going to be this rent to pay those mortgages and pay those bond holders.
Well, I think our fears, from here talking to owners, and again more on the multifamily side, I think on the commercial side there's been a lot more conversations in the last 3 weeks. Hey, we need to talk about our rent. The fear on multifamily is, now it's April 1st, rent's due. How many tenants have talked to their property owner management company and worked something out? There is, there's an eviction moratorium. You're supposed to, as a tenant, fill out, let the landlord know you've been affected by coronavirus and your income's down. It's been very hard. Like I said, it always seems to be this disconnect between housing, what you want as a solution, and how you get there in terms of policies that are made.
Yeah, I don't have any great answers for how we get through this kind of a crisis. This is as close to wartime as we were ever going to experience. And if you think about all the things that did happen during World War II, there was federal allocation of where raw materials would go. Right. There were very little housing construction happening during World War II. There was rent control imposed in most of the major cities. I don't think we need to go to that route because, frankly, we don't know if this is going to be a 3-month episode or a 9-month episode. We just don't know. And I'm having to have conversations with students who want to start our program in September, and I can't really promise them that it'll be in-person instruction. We could be in this situation for a very long time. It's good to see. It's good to see the state of Oregon right now holding steady on allowing for construction to continue. In Washington State, they've made decisions to shut down most market rate construction on the basis that there's some coronavirus risk in the construction. That to me seems to me a tremendous mistake. We should try to encourage social distancing amongst construction workers and be sensitive, to their health needs. But by and large, that I think most of that work can be done with safeguards in place. And obviously, there's some union company issues to sort out.
Well, I know federally they push to make sure management of residential housing and construction of residential housing was mandated as essential services to keep so you're not exasperating the problem. I think one thing that's been scary in this whole thing has been talking with people in the city is just their lack of understanding on how the housing system works from a construction regulation to a financing side. Saying to the city saying, we don't want people to be foreclosed on. That's great, but federal. They're all kind of waiting to see what the federal dollars do. But only 50% roughly of multifamily loans are federally backed. And so even if FHA and Fannie and Freddie come out and say we're going to do a forbearance for 90 days, that's great. But what do you do with the other groups? And it's just this lack of it's almost kind of like everybody's kind of kicking it and see what the next group's how going to handle it. And like these are, it's just very tough to get people in the same room to discuss a solution that, again, you're not going to satisfy everybody, but they need to be a better job of trying to work together to get through this thing.
It's a little bit frightening. I sat in on a webinar that the mayor, Ted Wheeler, did with respect to coronavirus with Portland Business Alliance.
Yeah, I was on that. Yeah.
To me, I was a little bit shocked that there weren't a lot of the more standard Andrew Cuomo type questions being asked, like, are you planning to use school grounds and parks for temporary hospitals? Are you planning to shut down our bus lines? I mean, are those? There just wasn't the sense of urgency. There was more questions about, trying to offer a benefit for this kind of firm or for that kind of firm. But some of these bigger issues of trying to acquiring ventilators and, creating safe distancing for hospital workers, those weren't the questions being discussed.
No, and we were just interviewing somebody running for city council. And just talking about there was a famous press conference last week where you had the mayor, you had the head of the county, and you had the governor, and it was just so disjointed, disconnected that there's just a lack of cohesiveness on how to work together. So it's a very the mayor's response to a lot of those questions, and that I was on that call as well, was, well, we're not, we're making sure that tenants can have this and that, but we're going to see what the federal side does in relief, and there's no kind of coherent plan. It is a little frightening, and I think it kind of goes back to what we've discussed for many years, you and I, about kind of the housing policy that it's done politically doesn't really address the issues, and if anything, it's sometimes making it worse from not expanding the urban growth boundary, adding regulations, things of that nature. That again, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Are you really addressing? Are you putting policies in place to do that? And somebody told me last week, the scary part also is this is an election year. So you got the perfect storm. We've got a crisis, and you have an election year. So some of the solutions, are they really solutions, or is it something that look about how I get reelected?
Well, we will have a whole host of ballot measures on May 19th.
Yes.
And whether there'll be, kind of a proper airing of all of those issues, I really don't know. Many of those measures were put together very hurriedly. I'm thinking right now of both of the homeless measure that's going to be on the May 19 ballot that Metro's put together. Right. As well as the transportation bond measure that's still being worked on for this November. On the homelessness measure, that is supposed to be funded largely by a tax on high income individuals. And then when they found that didn't raise enough revenue, they then said, well, we'll have I believe a tax on business income of some type.
Yes, business a tax. This is different than the CAT tax that's in place, which won't go into effect until next year. It's Muldoma's is a tax. I think it's a gross over $5 million. So you've got a tax on high income earners, and there's a tax on businesses. Then you have the CAT tax, which is the net tax over $1 million. So,
and the problem with a lot of these initiatives is they run they run completely counter to kind of standard good public finance. Standard good public finance would say that you would want a very broad-based tax to support your social welfare programs, and we've unfortunately capped the property tax, and we've maxed out, I think, the income tax that we could possibly charge. And we're in a state where you've got the Metro Core, which I think wants basically a higher level of public service than the Southern Oregon and Eastern Oregon, and we don't really have a good local mechanism for revenue to try to address that. Metro and TriMet are both funded with the payroll tax, which is we led with. It creates an enormous amount of cyclicality to it. And so it doesn't really provide the kind of steady long-term income for those kind of government services that residents of Multnomah County and the metro area would like to see happen. And so we're left with either kind of exactions on developers, exactions on existing landlords, or these half-assed taxes which distort our economic activity. I mean, the idea of the commercial activity tax, I think, is very unfair for people on small margins,
Right.
like retailers, and the high income earner tax, I think, is an invitation to people to move outside of Metro's boundaries, because because it's an income tax and not a payroll tax. You could be living in, let's say, Banks or McMinnville or Newburgh or Canby, working in Lake Oswego, working in Wilsonville, and you wouldn't be subject to the tax because you don't live inside the metro boundary. You live outside, and so I think it's going to be a tax that can be avoided, and that's going to distort behavior in ways that are completely unnecessary.
and what I mean, do you see? I mean, we've kind of talked about the dysfunction of some of the stuff that's been put in place from a regulatory and taxing. I mean, do you sense that, because you've been on the bandwagon about the urban growth boundary? I mean, is it politically, is it getting more open or more closed-minded to looking at different, or is it just, it always almost seems like in here locally, it's just always going back to the same well. I mean, I guess at some point when that gets pushed back, maybe they change. But I'm just curious, you're part of Portland State, the largest university here in the city of Portland. I mean, what is you're head of the real estate department there. Are they more open to these discussions, or is it still kind of this, I don't want to hear, we're going to kind of status quo it and see what happens?
I think this is a question of paradigm shift, and I think that the paradigm that we've lived in since the late 70s, put us on a certain pathway, and it was, the land use regulations were written in reaction to things that were happening in California, and the fact that California has some of the highest priced real estate, and yet you don't see high rises along the waterfront and along the California coast. I think those things were absorbed. So we became very much pro density, and made it relatively easy to build a project to high density, and that's good. So I want to give the planning system its credit, but the problem is that it was tied to this dislike or maybe even hatred of single family homes, and of the kind of housing that most Americans strive to live in. And so I don't think that they have a very good view about the fringe area of our metro area. And right. So the weird thing is that in 2017 we approved these 4 new urban growth boundary expansion areas. I think Metro kind of recognized that they needed to expand. But rather than doing the next step, which would be to come up with transportation grants to build arterials that would make these urban growth boundary expansion areas develop quickly, they basically left the cities on their own. So it's almost kind of a passive aggressive kind of attitude towards the suburbs, where they're letting them they're basically saying development should pay its own way to the nth degree. And I just think that, again, I think that some of this is an outgrowth of Measure 5 way back in 1990, where we've lost steady income for local governments. So local governments don't see themselves being able to be in the position of building arterials and building 4-lane roads and helping development happen faster. There aren't federal grants anymore for building new sewer treatment plants. But I think the challenge is if you stick to this mantra, the development has to pay its own way, and the developers say, well, we'll work in some other market, that you're really shortchanging yourself. And so the arterial that you build that makes South Cooper Mountain habitable and developable will benefit those people and those residents, but it'll also benefit the wider community. And so, I think it's a very unfortunate circumstance. So I would say, I would say that, American politics tends to be very entrepreneurially focused. Every candidate's out for themselves. I think that just in the same way that there was kind of a constellation of forces that made somebody like Neil Goldschmidt a winning candidate for mayor of Portland and a winning candidate for governor of Oregon, mayor of Portland and the governor of Oregon. I think there's the same constellation or a similar kind of constellation of forces if we find somebody who's socially liberal and economically progressive and interested in trying to get the economy moving again, and recognizing that we need housing built. It's very expensive to do for low income households, so go with the flow, build it for the upper third of the income spectrum to free up more housing for lower income folks, and to recognize the boundary should be used to protect the areas that we care about, right? The wineries, the waterfalls, the beautiful parts of Oregon. But most of the countryside in the Willamette Valley is a little bit nondescript. It's better put in housing development than it is, for a tenth of the price to grow strawberries or grass seeds or hazelnuts. And we just need to get over that and allow our region to develop. But again, it's going to take somebody, with who's more entrepreneurially focused, who sets up that campaign and runs it. We have some good candidates, for example, running for mayor, running for Metro Council, and I just think we need to find ways to support them.
Well, I hope it'll be interesting. I think one thing maybe may come out of this is that there'll be an understanding that if you don't do some support for businesses and job creation and maintaining jobs, if it's all on programs, that's, somebody was telling me yesterday, if we expand unemployment to deal with this crisis, which is great, but if we don't do anything with businesses, those people may get added benefits for 90 days, but then there's no job to go back to, and they've got to work together. And it just seems lately there's been this, we'll put it on the backs of, like you said, developers and all this, without understanding there is a benefit that's going to be society-wise. You can't just keep pegging one group to fund everything for the benefit. So it hopefully will, like you said, get a candidate that sees that, because it does seem like there's a little bit of a shift in terms of how, in this pandemic may lighten some things on how people look at things, of what they need and what's the expectation.
I'd also like to see the real estate organizations in town do better networking and come up with proposals that people can carry, right? Because it's not going to be in the nature of somebody running for public office who hasn't had industry experience to recognize these problems. I went to NAIOP breakfast that Ted Wheeler did a couple weeks ago, and he was kind of amazed. We have in our statutes requirements that within 90 days of a development permit proposal, that it gets reviewed and agreed on. But what we've gotten used to at the city is for the city officials to sit on their hands and basically say, we need an extension. And what I'm interested in, there's an interesting law that they passed in the state of Georgia, where they basically say if the city doesn't respond to either deem the application proposal as complete, that's at the beginning stage, or if they fail to make a decision on a proposal in 90 days, which is the state requirement, that the developer could go to a third party reviewer like a McKinsey or a GBD Architects or a ZGF Architects, who would review the proposal, look at the city, look at all of the city's interest and make a decision there. And in Georgia, they allow for 50% of the permit fee to then flow to that third party reviewer. I think if we had that kind of pro-development legislation passed in our state, it would really perk up the public sector to be much more responsive so that we would get the units built that we need built. Because right now it's costing a lot of money in order to get these projects off the ground, and we just don't have that I don't think we have that kind of luxury of time.
I think so. I would agree with you on that. Well, I thank you for taking the time. I know you've got a online class you've got to do now. This is like this whole new kind of paradigm that we're in now. So we'll have you again, and hopefully in a short period of time we're kind of getting back to some kind of normalcy, but we never know. And yeah, always great to have you on HFO-TV and kind of talking your take on the political as well as kind of land use. Times are changing, and there needs to be, I think, some different discussions on how we solve some of these issues. They're not that, they're complex. You just, even back to homelessness we talked about, just putting people in homes is great, but the wraparound services and what segment are you trying to work on? So again, I appreciate you taking the time today to talk with us. So thank you again.
Have a good day, and keep working on it.
We will. No, we will. Definitely. All right. Thank you. And thanks again for HFO-TV. We'll see you next time.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.